All right, apologies everybody for the slightly late start. My name is Bryce Wakefield and I'm the National Executive Director of the Australian Institute of International Affairs. Welcome all here today in Canberra, which are of course the traditional lands of the Ngunnawal people. We have quite a few people online. That's great. Just a bit of housekeeping. If you do have questions for our guest, please type them into the Q&A. And we're here, of course, to discuss NATO and the war on Europe, war in Europe. We're coming up to what is obviously quite a terrible anniversary. February 24th, of course, was the date when last year Russia launched its illegal war on Ukraine. And since then, most eyes have been on Europe, but there have been a lot of people too who have been looking at how the war has affected this side of the world. Just to give our institute a quick plug, we in last June in Singapore ran a roundtable on regional responses to the war in Ukraine, diplomacy, conflict and the future of Southeast Asia, the roundtable was called, and we'll be coming out with this publication in the next week or so. So go to our website to read that. It's internationalaffairs.org.au. Today, we are extremely delighted to welcome Janis Sarts to our institute. Since July 2015, Jānis, if I may, has served as director of the NATO Strategic Communications Center of Excellence in Riga. He's presented his views to several parliaments, the Federal Republic of Germany, France, Spain, as well as the Senate of the United States on Russia's disinformation aims and practices. He began his career in the Ministry of Defense in 1994 in Latvia, and over a 20-year career, he served as policy director, head of defense section of Latvia's delegation to NATO and EU, and special advisor to Georgia on defense reforms and NATO integration plans. Before taking up his position at the Centre of Excellence, he was the State Secretary at the Ministry of Defence Latvia for 7 years. And from 2012 to 2015, he was chair of the National Cyber Security Board. So somebody with a lot of experience and the perfect person to talk about NATO and war in Europe, consequences for global security. So, Jānis, if I could welcome you up to the podium to give your speech.
Thank you. Thank you so much for a very kind introduction. And yet again, I recognize I have to revise my CV because it makes me feel very old. And I probably have to shorten it quite a bit to uplift my spirits. But today, will try to present to you some of my views on what has caused and what are the reasons for the war right now we're seeing in Europe. What I think are the key parameters of what are at play in this war that are of interest, I think, for the global community, and what would, in my view, be the further consequences of this war and how it would be impacting the overall global trajectory of the security. So first and foremost, I'd like to start with the reason why did the war actually start. And don't be afraid, I will not go into the psyche of Putin for doing that. I'll try to look at the rational pieces. And I think the rational pieces are the ones where the head of Kremlin and his surrounding were understanding that the West is declining. And unlike a number of other actors, Russia, in fact, was also out of time. If you look at any of the parameters of power, economy, innovation, the number of people living in a country and the dynamic of that, Russia is quickly declining. So as a declining power, they had every interest to try to change that dynamic through challenging existing world system, which is Western dominated, which is in a way based on the way we see the values that have to be adhered in the international interactions. And in a way, one would not blame them for thinking that it would just work very well. Because if he would judge what were European NATO's responses to his grab of Crimea, his starting war in Donbass and Luhansk in 2014, you might quite understand why did he misjudge. If you think about the COVID and the way many of the democracies were somewhat inconsistent in handling it, raising a lot of public reaction, you would also understand where they came from. If you look at some of the internal political processes in some of the key allies with a lot of division within the societies, you would also understand why that might have seemed a good moment for such kind of action. So what is my premise here is the assessment was West is in decline, and this is the right time to challenge West. And if you think that is a war about Ukraine, then you have to take a moment, if you can, listen to what the Russian internal propaganda communication says. It is Russia's war on West. And although it is happening in Ukraine, we should not mistake that. It is Russia's war on the West. In my assessment, this idea of potentially challenging the Western-dominated global order, Russia is not alone in that. Probably some others believe the time is on their side. They can bide their time to find an opportune moment. But I think that is where we have to see this in context with other players that in fact have a very intense interest on how it plays out. But unlike Russia, they have more time. But what is good, if you can find anything good in that situation, which is very horrible, is that the judgment was wrong. Both on part how weak the West is, how easy it would be to undermine Ukraine, and what are the inroads that Russian different services have made into the Ukrainian elite and society so that it would kind of fall into the foot and slap without much of an effort. And one thing, and I would also remind you that many of the Western analysts, NATO's included, said Kiev would fall in 2 weeks. And that is, I think, another moment for us to reflect what actually means war. War, of course, is a battle. It is based, as the analysts always assume, the number of tanks, firepower, planes, helicopters, strategies. But one thing I would submit they forgot. War is basically contest of human wills. And whatever the technological development is, even in 21st century, as we can observe, it is still at the core of it, contest of wills. And in that, say, for me, from coming from a strategic communication, so this information role, it is yet again to remind us how important it is. Is it a novel thought? No. Back in his own day, Napoleon said that morale to the physique of troops is what is 3-to-1. And in a way, when I look at what is happening in the war in Ukraine, I get reminded of that saying by Napoleon. And the other key point I always also kind of are reminded when I look at this war, and that is that democracy is never as weak as it seems, and autocracy is never as strong as it likes to appear. And in a way, unless it all goes to this intense war, we've led to actually believe these two things, that democracy is because of we're debating all the time, there are political crises from time to time, there are differences of opinions. We take it for weakness. And in a way, at tactical times, I would agree it is a weakness that can be exploited. But if we think really about the kind of strategic events, it is also the strengths on what we can rely. Because as we've seen in Ukraine, and I know Ukraine quite well, I've been there many times, it is a difficult society. It was not unified. They had very different ideas where they have to go. Even the kind of values and cultures were different. Yet the key thing they agreed was that human or individual had a freedom. That is a major difference that distinguished them from Russia. And they have an agency. A citizen of Ukraine felt he or she had an agency. And that constituted the reason when this war started, suddenly everyone was surprised that they had a will. They might not have had enough tax, but they had the will to defend. On the other side, when we look at it, is it the will of Russian people that gets them fighting? Not quite. It is actually the Putin's and Kremlin's will that they try to instill on the Russian population. But that's not the people's will. That is not a mistake. And if I would argue, that is one of the vulnerabilities of Russian approach. And it is, in my view, what will be the reason they'll lose. But we cannot neglect the fact that despite all what those Russians have to go through that are asked up for mobilization, they still go. They still do that. If you look at what is happening with those that are mobilized, many of them don't get equipment. They have to self-equip. They go for the training. They don't have a proper training. Sometimes even they do not have a proper infrastructure where can they stay. They're treated poorly by their superiors. And of course, as we see them arriving on a battlefield, they are poorly equipped, not well trained, and most of the commanders use them as a cannon fodder. And for us observing that war, it's not an exaggeration. It's really quite stark how the tactics Russian commanders are employing and how much it disregards the human life. Of course, on the Ukrainian side, but also on the Russian side as well. And yet, despite all of that, the grip is such that still people go for mobilization. And that is, to me, also the sign of caution. Because if you think in the terms of the authoritarian system, isn't that what you want? When you have such a power over the people that you make your will theirs will, or There are no other wills than your own. And that is where I would have a sign of caution. We have to understand why is it happening. But also we have to understand many others that would, for very different reasons, wanting to replicate that, also be studying that. So when we look at other element of the war, and that is that the war happens in an information space of the 21st century. So the war in the kind of minds of people is primarily driven through digital means. And it is interesting when we have this kind of research on that, we see the bigger the crisis, the more critical the moment, the more people move to the digital space, basically leaving traditional media behind. What it means that the logic of a digital space also prevails to who is able to win the information part of the war. And the logic of the digital information space is network. And it has been very interesting to observe for us that what constituted, especially the early Ukrainian success in Europe, why they were so good at outperforming Russians and talking to European citizens, is not because their government powers, the well-preparedness, but it is because people spoke to people. We saw the phenomenon when basically major part of Ukrainian society took it to the information space to talk to others. They've tried that on Russians, not very successfully. And they tried it on Europeans and Americans, and there they did succeed. And that is where I think one of the interesting takeaways is when you have to talk and you have to win the heart, the emotions, the credibility, the ability to relate is extremely important. And in that say, it was very interesting how for Russia, for Putin, for vertical off communication, they didn't know how to handle it. That was the very difficult element for them, although, of course, they've been adjusting since. But as I've said, the Russia internally is a different story. And in a way, one of our researches, I think, is very telling. When we look at the Russian budget's expenditure in this 1 year, of course, as one might presume, with that intensity of war, the budget spending on the military goes like this. But what is interesting observation for us is the same exactly diagonal is for the Russian government spending on media. To the point where actually you have, I have 3 or 4 quotes from Russian officials that media is their weapon. And that is also something when we think about not only this particular situation, but others. And we've, in our part of the world, also have been saying, okay, Russians call that media because of the kind of freedom of speech. We let them in and have all that impact on our own societies because we kind of make it all free to everyone. But then, like, if you think it's true, none of them meet any of the standard of media. And in a way, now we've concluded that by the fact that we allowed them to function, but not really being a media, but very much state-funded long-term weapon in our region, we actually undermined our own media because they have to function in market logic and et cetera, et cetera. And that is something that, well, in the wartime, Baltics have taken away the right for the Russian media to communicate in our own parts, because it's just straight inciting for violence. But I would say there's a bigger lesson to that, is if somebody says, if an elephant says it's a duck, it doesn't necessarily make it a duck. But we somehow kind of, oh, he said he's a duck, so he's in a ducks category. And I think that is also, once again, the complacency. Because the other big element is, when we look especially at Europe, not only Ukraine, is that Russia has been shaping the environment to make that possible for a long term. And the responses have been very different. And I know the instinct, you see some malign activity in your own space, and then you think, what do I do? And many times you might have this decision, oh, it's politically very sensitive, it might undermine some of the business opportunities, therefore I take some secret action, but otherwise it's hush hush. What is the result of it? The result of it is society doesn't understand they are under the attack. And I think that's the wrong way about it. That is what I would present to you is one of the lessons from our region in Europe, is you have to speak up. When you see something like that happening, you have to speak up. You have to be data-based, that is correct. You have to be able to attribute correctly. But that is important, that when the public cohesion, ability to defend yourself is targeted, public deserves to know. There's all the data behind that. Because I'm sure you all know that story about the frog that has been put in a water that is slowly heating up. And frog has all the options to leap out of it. But because it's so slow and slow, it just doesn't recognize when the water is boiling and it dies. And in a way, sometimes some of the nations I see in the same context, that there is an increasing attempt to undermine exactly what I said was the most important thing, which is the will to defend, to will to stand up. And yet we kind of, okay, that is okay, that's not that bad, this is also not bad. And then suddenly you're already boiling. Too late. So that is also something that I would submit to you, is something that would be a lesson to be taken. So the other thing I assume when other players globally would be looking at the war, that is that it is far better to have the effects of this boiling frog rather than have to go to the full-scale kinetic war. It's very high risk, it's high cost, while the other part is much more rewarding at much lower cost. And in a way, I would assume, and that is my personal view, that Russia is going to lose that war. You can quote me on that. That the lesson will be not to do, but is to do it much more subtle way, because that has proven to be actually more effective. Now, on the lessons of the kind of strategies of war. And of course, for many of you, when you look at it and have studied war, the history of war, it's very much a 20th century war. It's quite interesting that I've got not only the Second World War parallels, but even the First World War parallels that I see time and time again in that battlefield. But of course, we shouldn't be fooled. It looks like that because none of the sides have a supremacy, and therefore the logic is going in this kind of way. But there are other notable things. The war is all of the society. So the idea we've started to kind of adapt to, that in the war, it's only the military, the army, when it's a really big deal, is whole of society. You know, you ask the Ukrainians somewhere on a border with Poland, that individual that might have no links whatsoever with the military is very much involved in the war, both as a victim, but also the one that tries to do something for his country or her country to win. So in a way, and that is also a lesson from our part that have seen a lot of Russian influence and attempts, is we have to have whole of society approach. The resilience that we seek to create does not rest in the government. It rests into the members of the society. And that is what you would hear Bolt saying, what you would hear Finns saying, that is what you would hear Swedes saying, that is what you have to build. And that is a tricky thing, isn't it? Because if you live in a peace, have seen nothing but peace, it's hard to shift that mentality that the war is coming. And in a way, it is interesting because we three Baltics have been saying for quite a few years, to rephrase the famous phrase, winter is coming, crisis is coming from Russia. And of course, many times, many countries said, oh, Russophobics, you're traumatized by your history. You don't understand nothing. We have a better view. And of course, not that much listening. But in a way, now everybody recognizes that actually we were quite right. We had it exactly right. And unfortunately, many have disregarded that and not really prepared. And also that led, which is also something I would submit to you, lack of strategic thinking. Because one thing also we have to have is not only a tactical political thinking, what we do based on our current interests, primarily economic ones, which for the authoritarian systems is easy to manipulate. And we think, oh, there's a terrific gas deal with Russia. Let's jump into it. They're ready to buy some infrastructure. Let's sell it. But we missed the point that created a strategic leverage that we missed, but they understood all the time. And much of that action was actually based on that logic rather than anything else. So what we have to do, and energy is not the only field, technologies, emerging technologies, data, AI, all of those constitute strategic areas where we have to be very, very considerate and strategic about developing dependencies and giving leverages. Because what we've seen at the times, it's going to cost and haunt us. So we have to develop that thinking. And in a way, if I would say what I think is coming, we are yet again in the world of competition, contest, conflict of systems. One of the subjects that we're looking right now is why did Russia perform so well in what is termed Global South? It has carried a lot of their own narrative and messages quite successfully there. But I think we have to recognize for quite some time, there have been strategies at work to shape that cognitive space in many parts of the world in a way where democracy looks like a bad deal. An authoritarian system is the kind of the shining example of how to live. And if we just think it's okay, well, who cares how in Africa the people would choose to live? I think that is yet again lack of strategic thinking. It is for developing the systems where countries prefer individual control over the societies, depriving freedoms of choices. And we, I would argue, at least in Europe, we've been there quite some time ago, and we know what is the result of it. It's very ugly. But humans have this problem of forgetting the history lessons. We kind of say, well, we remember the history taught, but if you look at the practical behavior, no, we tend to forget all the time. And that is something that I would, of course, plea here, although some of that might be forgotten in the next minute, is that in that context and contest of systems, we have a stake. Not in a way that we have to be like very strong and say, you have to do that this way or else. But I very much would bring back my own personal experience at a time when Soviet Union collapsed. I was 18 years old. I was living in Riga back in the time. And you know, one of the key drivers for that was not, saying directly, but the fact that we understood and knew that the living in that democratic society feels so much better. The experience, the ability to express yourself, having options in lives. That was what was one of the key drivers, at least in our part of the world, the Baltic states, to go so strongly for regaining independence. And that is something we kind of forgotten, that eventually it's far better to live from an individual perspective, the experience of a democracy with all its pitfalls and problems. There are no utopias, we know that. But still, in that context of systems, we have a strong card that we've forgotten to play. So what is then what we have to take away from this? The war in Ukraine, obviously, in its kinetic nature, is regional. Yet, the consequences are global, and the information element of that war is global. So in a way, that invites the idea of a need to cooperate. And yes, the institutions like NATO have been very much based on geography. And for very good, sound reasons, because there's the kind of distance and all these military logics. But as we see this warfare develop into the information digital space, into the technological space, into the cyberspace, those do not have boundaries. They are actually, by definition, global. And in a way, one of the takeaways we've not followed through on that in our corporations. Many times, I've seen like-minded countries having to fight it alone. So one of the reasons me being here is to look for those partnerships. That is the reason I assume Australia has decided to become part of the center that I have a pleasure to lead. That is because in these areas, this ability to cooperate, have a ability to see into kind of similar strategic perspective, and hopefully coordinate the effort is what we seek to do. If you would ask, what is the end state for this war? As I've said, I think Russia loses. Because in three key areas that are so important for warfare, command and control, they've been poor from the day one. They can't do joint operations, like still today. It's 21st century. Logistics. If you have a very corrupt system, it's kind of logical that your logistic doesn't work. And the third place, and as I've said, is a battle of wills. Because I don't think on that battle, Russia, with all the Kremlin's kind of big success internally, they would eventually be able to outperform Ukrainians that are ready to die for their country. But that, of course, I believe will lead for further instability. Because I think if there is a loss in Ukraine, that would inevitably create instability in Russia. And I hesitate to pan out the scenarios, how it would play out, because so many variables. But for coming from a country that's neighboring Russia, my home is about 200 kilometers from a Russian border. I know it is going to be very unpleasant. But also, I think it will set into the dynamic the pieces at a global scale. And in a way, if that scenario of challenging the West, as Russia did, fails, I'm not saying the others would not try to challenge. They probably will not repeat the same steps. And in a way, in my view, that is in our interest. But if they succeed, not only the next challenge will be sooner, way sooner, but also the brutality elements and these extreme loss of life will also be something that would be copied. So, although many across the globe don't have a seemingly direct stake in the outcome, I still do believe that we have that, even very far from Ukraine. And what happens there would have a direct implication also for people living here. And in my mind, there's a clear link and unmistakable. With that, I would thank you very much for your interest and would be ready to take the questions.
Excellent. Yep. Those are my person, not here. So, no. Could you please, yeah. Which? Okay. Just make sure that light's on. Martin.
Thanks, Bryce. Martin from the local branch here. I'd like you to correct me if I'm wrong, but many years ago, I thought I recalled NATO entreating with Ukraine to join it, or at least some sort of initial accession plans, much like the EU. If that's the case, then was that, if not an incentive for Russia to invade, it's certainly some sort of mild justification for its incursion, recognising the traditional historical Russian view about needing a buffer between the West and Russia. So is that, am I correct or not?
Well, actually, I was at the summit back in the day. That was Bucharest, if I remember, 2008. There was a big push. Primarily, that was for Georgia, but also for Ukraine to get an invitation. There were nations that were against. And eventually, I saw that was the actual heads of state around the table that wrote that language that we all live with. Did it have an impact on the way Russia behaved? I don't think so. Because I think Putin is true when you read his essay of Russia and Ukraine being one people from 2021. And whatever the perspectives for Ukraine, the only logic is that Ukraine has to be under Russian control. So how does this enlargement of NATO potential would have affected it? I think the fundamental problem with that premise is that you would, by saying that Russia has the right to say what other nations can or cannot do, you throw out the logic and the principles of values that we live by for last, like as a West, for basically most of the time after the Second World War. We enjoy that only for 30 years. So by doing so, we do something Russians would love us to do, and they would start bargaining. They actually all the time wanted to bargain. And if you didn't miss, there were 3 times at least when Putin offered to divide Ukraine as the Poland was divided. And I don't think that was a trick. That was his true belief. So in a way, how NATO would have been able to create that kind of worldview, I'm not sure. It's more kind of an internal logic and internal evolution of thought. And if you follow the Russian internal dynamic, you can see how it evolved. Would the idea that NATO and West is against Russia would not have formed if the NATO would not have taken up the Baltics and wouldn't have left the doors open for others? I think what we would be talking is about the war in Baltics right now. So from the way I see the situation, we just moved that to a different place. But that was basically if Putin would have succeeded in building a strong country, that seems to be almost inevitable trajectory. Because if you look at his speeches in 2022, I would say they are right out of the 19th century. And kind of, I don't think we have in the 21st bow to the logic of the 19th. We know where it leads. We want to construct something better. Well, like in our own societies, people have agency. Also, even small countries or smaller countries or weaker countries have the choices of their own, not the ones that dictated by somebody who happens at that point in time just to be bigger. So I think in practice, it didn't really, but also in a philosophical level, I don't think we as a West could have behaved differently and not ourselves undermine the key principles of the system we've built.
But do we have another in the audience? Yep, over here. Sorry to make you run all the way. Sorry, we'll come back to you. We'll first go online and then we'll come back.
Thank you, Robin Fitzsimons, Institute member. I was fascinated by that. I happen to have had a press pass to that 2008 Bucharest meeting. And I remember it was expected that Lavrov would speak. And then he didn't turn up. We wondered why. And Putin, who was a guest, turned up. And it was like something out of a soliloquy out of Richard III. It began very quiet and became progressively more demotic about this potential map pathway. But what was being said at the time, or one of the things that was being said, was that there was a difference of perspective between the United States, who were pushing for the pathway, versus the European nations who had a different perspective. To what extent was that true, and what was it based on?
Well, even in Europe, there were very different views. And the attempt, as always is the case in NATO, with so many nations having to agree, it was where the compromise can be found. And at any layer but the actual heads of state, that was not possible. So in a way, yes, there were US, but also some Europeans and some other Europeans that were of different opinions. But what is interesting, I think very important to understand, they were not disputing the principle of countries choosing their paths. They were disputing whether this is a right time to say these words. And that is where was the difference. And in a way, as I've said, I saw that it was ultimately, just exactly the heads of state that wrote these things, and the rest is history.
We do have a couple of questions in the Q&A. You've answered a few of them already with your previous responses, but there are questions asking really you've mentioned that you believe that Ukraine will win, but essentially what does winning look like in this situation? Because what we have are two, as you've noted with Ukraine, very, very determined force on the side of Ukraine and on the side of Putin and Russia, if not the army are determined, then perhaps the leadership is. How far does this go? There are questions in the Q&A, for example, asking about nuclear weapons. How likely, in your opinion, is it that Russia will use a tactical nuke in order to avoid defeat in conventional warfare? What does winning look like?
I think one could quote General Miley. He recently said that Russia has been already defeated strategically, operationally, and tactically. Of course, it's not necessarily the same thing as to say that Ukraine has won. And I would argue that for Ukraine, in my view, winning constitutes ability to regain legally recognized territory, and Russia not ready and able to repeat any of that military invasion. So these are the two components, in my view, that are kind of the constitutes of winning. And half a year ago, that probably would have been a very different place. And I would also probably say, as a kind of my point of view, it would be highly difficult to attain that in a purely military way. But yet again, I return to this idea of wills, the reason people fight. And just observe that, in fact, soldiers of Russia that are dying in Ukraine have no reason to. And I'm wondering if Ukraine is able to push forward in some time frame in the future, what kind of effect would that have on the morale of people that have been asked to die in a very miserable way, but actually have no reason to fight? And that is where I'm kind of thinking where the potential way of the victory lies. Because once again, it's not only about the mathematics of tanks and armor, it's also about the human wills that we have to factor in. On the nuclear question, that's been repeatedly asked, so not a new one. I think clearly, every time Russia, and Putin in particular, feels weak, he evokes nuclear rhetorics. And we've seen consistently it reappear every time. The trouble with that, even rhetorical level, is you blunt your weapon. If you've seen the reaction in Europe and NATO on the first, it was like, now, oh, yet again, yeah, we've listened, we waited for it. So you cannot consistently apply that strategy with efficiency to function. Well, what does that translate into the actionability of that? In a military sense, tactical and nuclear weapons don't make sense at all. Like, that changes nothing, exactly nothing in a battlefield. It has a strategic implication, but what kind of strategic implication would it have for Russia if it doesn't change anything on a battlefield? First, they would have to consider the Chinese reaction, which I don't think will be. That is probably, in my assessment, a red line. Would that, on what reasons they should believe that that would weaken resolve of the West? I think that's, of course, it's up for dispute. We've not been there. We don't quite know. But I don't think also they cannot be sure. And then again, for Putin himself, it doesn't change anything. For him, what is far more dangerous, in my view, is internal situation, because no one in the West wants to do anything within Russia. Ukraine, the last thing they would want is to go and have, something within Russia. So if I would imagine myself how they would be thinking if they do that rationally and have a proper information access, which is still a question, is for them, it's far more dangerous, what is happening inside, but you can't solve that with nuclear weapons, do you? So I think it is likely. It's not like you can rule out of, but I think as we go on, it is decreasing in the likelihood, even less so. But of course, when a major nuclear power is in such kind of conflict, the risk is always there. I do not want to put it away as such, but I don't think that risk is huge. And I don't think that rhetorical part of that is any indication of the actual thinking.
There was
Hi there, thanks. Sort of been answered before, but it's just about the kind of framing of the NATO, the growth of NATO and the people joining NATO in the politics. It's I guess there's a risk of kind of the way that it's framed as kind of NATO expansion as a justification for Russia takes a lot of, in my mind, agency away from the countries that are trying to join. I mean, like you mentioned, there's these hundreds of years of historical reasoning of why they wanted to join. And if we're saying, oh, it's NATO stepping on Russia's toes, are we not ignoring the fact that these countries desperately wanted to join for their own protection?
Well, you're absolutely spot on that. And it's actually, well, I'm Latvian. So when I looked at the atrocities in Bucha, I suddenly have images of what happened in Latvia during Ivan the Terrible's invasion, where, people were slaughtered in a way that there was a big castle where the people were hiding, and there was a breach by the Ivan the Terrible forces, and they rather choose to blow up the tower with a powder and go all under the rubble than being exposed to what was waiting for them if they get in the hands of the Russian soldiers in 16th century. Well, isn't it a telling story of how we feel, how it is for us? So absolutely, that is one of those. And in a way, I would argue, I would have been happy if all of that was right, that the Western countries were saying to us, you're paranoics. And actually, the world would have been much better if we turned out to be paranoics and, damaged by history. But unfortunately, as we see right now, we actually had it exactly right, as I've said. And they were kind of trying to live the dream that was not there. So, yes, you're right. And this is about some of the fundamental principles of the Western kind of world that we live by. Is that you're small? Is that you are not having such a big impact in the international stage, make you an object to others? And as I've said, we actually seen that happening. We know where it leads. We know what happens. And actually, if you look at Russia, it's exactly what they tried to think about and how they understood the world. And yet again, it's the same thing that happens. So even more the reason for sustaining the rules and the principles.
Okay, we've got one on the front, and then we'll come to you, Sārts.
Thank you. Matthew Newhouse at the Australian National University, now till recently ambassador to the Netherlands, and so quite involved with these issues over last year. You've made a very compelling case, and I think a very accurate case, on the way that NATO has operated and come together. But my question is about the world outside NATO. We still see countries like South Africa engaging in military operations and with Russia. We see Russia very engaged in West Africa and so forth. How do you see NATO sort of winning the information war with the rest of the world? And does your center have a role in that?
Well, strictly, not really. And one of the reasons is that, as I've said, the recognition that in information space, it's a global war came too late. And of course, Also, when you, and we do actually, as we speak, the research on what has happened and what was the reason for kind of a Russian success in a number of areas. But clearly you see it's not about big resources that have been put in, but existing narratives that are being exploited by Russia and also by China, I would argue. Colonial sentiments, West's hypocrisy and double standards, all of that have been the narratives in many parts of the world on which now Russia builds. And much of that, some, of course, history is history, but much of that is not accurate. But in a way, when we look what we do, we as a collective West, unlike I would argue China first and Russia secondly, we're trying to see the world as a stage where competition and conflict of systems is happening. We didn't really do that. It was for us a business as usual. And that is probably, at least for me, kind of the thing that we have to learn and adjust to. What is our role? We, as a center, we are not operational communicators. Our key role is to create knowledge and help NATO and allies and partners with that knowledge to build their own capability and ability to function in that space. And therefore, this research, we hope to team up also with a number of players in this region to make it as comprehensive as possible so that the insights are kind of really across different regions, different areas, and we can have a as accurate picture as possible.
Right, we are at time, but I will go for one more because we would get started a little later. And Sasha, you've been waving at me since the beginning, so.
Yes. I'm a hybrid. I'm a professor here at the University of Canberra. I'm also with NATO. We shape as a fellow here for hybrid warfare and lawfare. I'm a German army officer before. And so I had this whole sort of pleasure of seeing Putin 2007 Union conference, talking of glory to Russia, so to speak. And now it's time to bite back. Then comes the cyber attack Estonia. Then comes 2008 Georgia. Then we come, I was part of it 2011, we do our CHT in Tallinn. We talk about hybrid threats. Nobody talks about Russia back then. Then the whole thing ceases, no center of excellence, only later Finland, etc. So you guys, obviously, in that regard, you steered the right course. You use information influence operation, basically segment. Now, my question is, if I move forward 2015, Stoltenberg says, the little green man in Crimea, they are basically hybrid warfare. We work on a hybrid warfare doctrine, which we have now. We have a cell for hybrid warfare, awareness, etc. So everything what you do, educate, collaborate, etc. My question is, and that is really what I would like your opinion. Hybrid warfare as a concept, we made mistakes. I wrote 70 articles, I made mistakes. I wrote about Gerasimov doctrine. We talked about this 1.5 pages as the new thing, the new hybrid warfare, etc. So many people did it. I was not the only one. What I would like to know is hybrid warfare as a force multiplier, as a, you can say, especially the information domain, which you mentioned, preparing the battleground. In other words, Ukraine 2015 was, you can say, small scale, not exercise, but it was a small scale operation. And the 2022, that would have happened anyway. Seeing hybrid warfare as on its own, trying to butter up the West, trying to win governments, having Hungary, having Germany, having Trump, for example, winning without firing, winning without kinetic.
Sasha,
and if that's failed, then sorry.
Could we have a quick question?
My question is, sorry, 2022. Does it mean that the hybrid warfare doctrine approach of Putin failed, and that's why he went kinetic? Or was hybrid warfare just something what the West misunderstood, and he used just elements of it? Apologies, boss.
I think first and foremost, the hybrid warfare was our concept, not the Putin's concept. In many ways, we actually look at the Russia's concepts, they differ quite significantly. So there are the other concepts you have to talk. I think he now realizes it didn't deliver, but one of the reasons he actually took the action is probably he thought he had it in his pocket, which he miscalculated in a large way. I would argue that's because he's been authoritarian leader for so much time and people don't tell him truth. It's not productive. But as a concept, isn't that an option? I think it is still. And I just wonder what would be the lesson from all of that. And one of those might be that, in fact, you should pay a bit more attention and time for this kind of subtle effects. And going all that force in is actually a bit of a kind of undermining problem. And that is my assumption. We'll see. But certainly we have to remember we're not the only ones watching. Taking lessons will be done by many players. And therefore also our lessons have to be very clear, accurate. And frankly, I don't mind the way we call these things as long as we understand them correctly and are able to prepare the concepts and capabilities and train them to counter. And in fact, in the influence area, one of the key things is go public. Tell people what is happening because they are the target. And that is one lesson that you can take from us. Tell people.
Very good. All right. Well, I think we can all agree that that was a magisterial coverage of many of the issues that are, of course, leading world conversation today, quite unfortunately. Thank you for coming here. I hope you've had a good time in Australia and you were in Singapore earlier. I don't have anything about Singapore, but I'm going to present you with fear of abandonment, which is considered to be sort of the cornerstone history of Australian foreign policy, and also coincidentally written by our national president, Alan Gingell. So please,
So
thank you very much. And thank you, everybody. Good night.